Thank you, everyone, for joining, and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmarked. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tool, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly bookmarked. Boy, bookmarked is our monthly book club, and this is our seventh event. This edition of Lead Dev Bookmarked is sponsored by Work and Co. Thank you to them for helping us put this together. Make sure to join the Lead Dev Slack space. We'll take some questions live and continue the discussion there afterwards. You can find the details at leaddev.com/bookmark. I'm Suzan Bond, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup and an executive coach. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me on Twitter at Suzan Bond. Today we'll be talking about realizing empathy, an inquiry into the meaning of making with Slim, who I've been talking with. Slim helps improve the leadership performance of founders in pursuit of innovation by supporting the development of their mindset and their relationships and interactions with stakeholders. By invitation from Singularity University and SAP, as he has served as the leadership performance coach for over 100 founders. Prior to his focus on startups, Slim helped Fortune 500 companies and the Department of Defense. High-tech product and service innovations he has helped them achieve have won numerous awards, including the CES Innovation Award. His first book is titled Realizing Empathy. Welcome to today's bookmarked event.
Thank you for having me, Susan. Really, really appreciate it.
Apologize for my tongue. Somehow today I'm tripping over it. So we're gonna hopefully it gets better. So I'm curious, what was the impetus for writing a book about empathy? Like, where did the idea for the book come from?
Well, so the interesting thing is, I didn't begin by writing a book about empathy. In fact, I didn't even begin by writing a book. What I did was I began by writing a diary. Right? So you'll notice actually some diary entries are directly quoted in the book. And all the stories you read in the book were also once incomprehensible diary entries. So it kind of took a long time to turn those incomprehensible diary entries into stories. But that's basically where they began their lives. And the less incomprehensible entries were directly quoted in the book in the hopes that, either myself or a reader might one day feel inspired to further develop kind of the seed of an idea that's sort of embodied in those diary entries. Oh, you seem muted.
Oh, I got muted. Oh my gosh. Okay.
How did that happen? We shall not be silent.
My tongue was like, I'm not ready. So I'm curious. So why did you begin writing a diary at all?
Well, so I've written diaries almost like a habit since I was a teenager. So now I'm in my mid 40s. So I've been a diary writer, hello, I'm a diary writer for about 30 years or so. And it was sort of my way of processing difficult emotions because I'm an only child. So when there are things that I find difficult to talk with to my parents about, I would just write diaries. That's just how I think I process things. So in this case, I began writing these diaries in 2008. And at the time, I had just left my job of 9 years in the field of human-centered design. And I was off to basically conduct research into the creative process found in visual and performing arts. But soon after I began that research, I started to experience significant anxiety and symptoms of what I've come to learn of like some kind of a PSD-like thing, or what's called hypervigilance. So, and just to be clear, I didn't know at all at the time that this was what was going on. I didn't know what anxiety was. I didn't know what hypervigilance was. But at the same time, I did feel difficult emotions. So I kind of intuitively guided myself to write a diary, as I've always done so as a teenager.
That's so great. Yeah, I mean, hypervigilance and anxiety or any sort of like mental health kind of conditions can be really helped by writing things down. And there's lots of research on that, I think. And I'm curious, why did you, what was the anxiety and hypervigilant about when you were, doing the research?
Well, so the way I did my research was that I enrolled in an art school, right? And I did this because I wanted to feel what it's like to be an artist, right? So I personally thought that would be the only way to do the research justice. And I was going to do the usual, interviews and observations, typical research projects do. But I've done that in the past as a human-centered designer, so I kind of knew that they weren't going to be enough. And afterwards, I really ended up appreciating the fact that I took a very personal approach because I learned so many things that I would not have learned otherwise. Because I think art is very personal, so I try to put as much of that in the book as I can. But the thing that I didn't write about in the book is how much I struggled throughout the research, right? And I think it's because most people at art school could not understand or appreciate what the hell I was doing, right? And to be fair, I think that's partly because I didn't understand or appreciate it fully either, right? And because I said in the book, I didn't really set out to write a book. I was just writing diaries to keep myself from going insane. So it wasn't clear that even empathy was the keyword until halfway through the research. And not only that, but it wasn't until a year after I finished art school that the bulk of my diaries became comprehensible enough to be read by people. So while I was in art school, I don't think I had any idea how to explain what I was doing. And what made it worse was because it was an art school, professors expected me to make things, right? Like paintings or sculptures or whatever. So people would often ask me, like, what are you making? And I would show them like, a wooden sculpture I had made. And because I'd only just learned how to make sculptures, it wouldn't look so great. So they'd look at me a bit funny and they would eventually ask, why did you make this? Which I think is euphemism for this looks really shitty. There has to be a reason why you made this. Otherwise, it makes no sense.
I'm taking a note about this. Why did you make this?
Why did you make this, right? So
this might not be so good.
Right. So then, like, kind of like in my defense, I would launch into this like monologue, trying to tell them my whole life story about how I came from technology and human-centered design, and how I used to think art is bullshit, but now I don't, and how I think art has a lot of value, blah 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 blah. And they would wait patiently, and they would usually respond in one of three ways. One is either they say, I don't know what you're talking about, but whatever. Or stop what you're doing. You should do something else. And then some people would say, oh, that's so interesting. Keep going. Right? And very few people said, that's very interesting. Keep going. Right? Most people would say, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, but whatever. But then many professors in my own department said, stop what you're doing. You need to do something else. And I just to sort of like make this fair, I completely understand why they did this. They didn't see the value of me making shitty looking wooden sculptures. It's no different than me looking at my incomprehensible diary entries and like wondering where this is going, right? It just, these are only obvious in hindsight, right? So the thing that I only had was a hunch at the time that there's something about the process of woodworking or working with materials in general that is of significant value, but I didn't know exactly what the value was. So it was just a hunch. So like now, if this was like a design project, I may have compromised with these professors, but this was very different because it was very personal. I mean, I had quit my job. I had taken out a 6-figure loan. A lot was sort of hanging on the line, and there was no guarantee on return on investment. So I think I really fought back these sort of kind of objections to what I was doing. And then they said, if you don't stop, we're going to kick you out. That's basically the kind of the ultimatum they gave me. And I think being the intellectually driven person that I am and was, I think from then on, I became very clever and very politically correct, just to sort of stay under the radar, to make sure I'm not going to get into trouble. But I still did the research under the cover anyways, which meant that I felt like I could no longer be myself in any of the times that I'm, either in my department or in some of the regular classes. So basically, I think I just felt really misunderstood, underappreciated, just attacked and disrespected on a regular basis. So I think in some ways it was kind of like a survival instinct to try and kind of make sense of this, but I couldn't make sense of it at all. So I think a lot of the insecurity, anxiety, and self-doubt and hypervigilance just sort of arose out of that time when I didn't feel really understood or appreciated. And then people who I thought was on my side, who were professors in my own department,
Yep.
threatened to kick me out, and there was nothing that I really could do. So to them, I think I probably came across as very arrogant, because I was like making up all these sort of excuses why I think this is valuable. But once again, I fully admit I didn't know. I really didn't know what the answer was. So I was just making things up. So from their perspective, I probably just seemed like some ignorant, arrogant person, which I fully admit I probably did seem like. But at the same time,
Yeah.
it's something I've come to appreciate as this is just a coping mechanism that comes out of a human being who is in dire sort of stress, basically.
Well, yeah, and I'm curious, how did this experience help you understand and appreciate, what it's like to be an artist? You know what I mean? Given all of the challenges that you faced, professors and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I mean, it's sort of like it's like a twofold thing, right? So in the book, I fully admit in the very beginning that I did think art is useless bullshit. I think
Hmm.
that's and that artists were a bunch of self-indulgent narcissists. I think that's literally how I used to say and think. I
Hmm.
think in my 20s, right? But what I learned from the experience of going through art school is what many artists do is they put their sense of self and self-worth on the line to
Hmm.
do nothing more than follow a hunch. Right? Now, if following your hunch yields a product that meets societal expectations, right? And then people understand and appreciate what you're doing, that's great. That's wonderful, right? But if not, and in the majority of cases, this is the actual part that really happens, then their sense of self and self-worth is at risk, basically, right?
Yep.
By people like me who judge and criticize them for being self-indulgent narcissists who are doing useless bullshit, right?
Yep.
Um, I mean, which means they'll constantly experience existential doubt, anxiety, and all sorts of things like that. So I think in the past I could never understand why some artists got so depressed that they would commit suicide.
Hmm.
Because from the outside, it looked like they were having the time of their life. Like they're just doing whatever the hell they want, and they're just following their heart, and it's just so amazing. But now I do understand why they would
Mm.
commit suicide, because they're basically putting their sense of self and self-worth at risk to follow their dreams and to do their life's work, right?
Right.
Now, and if in the process, if their sense of self and self-worth gets attacked or damaged, then they might at some point lose all meaning and purpose behind why they're even alive, at which point committing suicide almost becomes logical, right?
Mm.
So I think, in some ways, not only did I come to appreciate the sort of the process and the skill sets involved in the creative process, but also the sort of the mental aspect, the psychological and
Yeah.
the interpersonal aspect of what it's like to go through that process.
Well, yeah, and I think there are absolutely, as you talk about in the book, like creators in general, and software may not feel to the degree around the, suicide, but the idea of like being misunderstood, or what am I here for and what am I creating? And the part about like have your change of heart towards artists was hinted at, but not fully articulated in the book. I'm curious, was that intentional?
It wasn't intentional. It's just that like I don't think I fully processed that
Mm.
until I went on tour with the book in 2013. So at the
Mm.
time of the writing of the book, I think I mostly focused on reflecting on my research of the creative process. Like it's like as if the
Mm.
creative process is a subject matter, right? But then it was less so reflecting on the creative process of doing the research itself, which is
Mm.
kind of meta, right? So what happened when I went on tour was I would talk about my book during the talk. And then I would also talk about the making of the book when somebody approaches me during an individual Q&A session. And I would often talk about, how isolating it felt and all sorts of things of that sort. And in that process, I met a group of startup founders
Mm.
who resonated very deeply with my experience of making art. Right? And
Yep.
they told me what I called being an artist would just as easily be swapped with being a founder. Right?
Mm.
If we were to put the superficial differences aside and focus solely on the sort of the emotional content and the constant existential threat part of it. Now, if I hadn't experienced what it was like to be an artist, I don't think I would have understood what that meant. But when they made the connection, it like immediately clicked, right? I mean, founders, just like artists,
Mm.
follow their hunch, like an idea they believe is worthy of being understood and appreciated. But it isn't until they shape their idea into something like a product or service that can be understood and appreciated by people that they actually get that understanding and appreciation. So until that happens, they're constantly experiencing existential threat and through oppositions and rejections, just like the way I was threatened by my professors. They're getting threats from investors, co-founders, employees, or any from their own family members for that matter.
Yep.
And I think it's a very difficult sort of a thing. So, but in some ironic way, I sort of found my tribe without really knowing that this was the tribe that would most accept my research. Because I mean, to be honest, when I wrote, even after I wrote the book, I was still in that state. I was like, I mean, I think this makes more sense, but it's still unclear. Like who would find this of value besides somebody who just went through art school? So it wasn't until they sort of helped me feel appreciated that I felt kind of like started to feel more alive again. And I think in some ways it's sort of like, I wrote a book about empathy because I didn't empathize with artists. This was like, so the empathy became like a motivation. But then the
Yep.
research was also about me learning to move myself from not empathizing with artists to empathizing with artists. But in the process of trying to do this, I was not empathized with by certain people.
Yep.
And then, finally I was able to find a group of people who did empathize. So it's like empathy is like all over the
Yep.
the place when it comes to writing this book.
Well, yeah, and it's really interesting because as you note in the book, there isn't a consensus on what we mean by the word empathy. I think we talk about it a lot. And I'm wondering, can you share the definition you use in the book for those of for those who have not read it yet, just to ground
Sure.
the next part of our conversation?
Absolutely. And is it okay if I use the definition that I use now instead of the one in the book?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Because I sort of like changed it since I've written the book. So, and I think it's important before we define the word empathy, I believe it's important to first admit that empathy is a word that has a purpose, right?
Mm.
Because it's a human object, like a human being made it for a distinct purpose, right? And the purpose is to explain something. Right? And it's the same with the word gravity. Like, gravity is trying to explain something. If you believe the folklore of Isaac Newton, gravity is a word he used to explain why an apple went from A, top of the tree, to B, bottom of the tree. Right? So there was a phenomenon that he wanted to explain, and gravity was the way to explain it. It's very much similar with empathy, right? So when you look at the history of how the word empathy came to be, it began by trying to explain why we as human beings go from point A, which is where we feel separate from a piece of artwork, to point B, which is where we feel as if we are entering into a piece of artwork, right? So there's this sort of immersive quality, very similar to, when we talk about things like flow, right? So I think it's also worth mentioning that it didn't start off with people. It was in our relationship with artwork. That's where the actual history of empathy began. It was only later that this was expanded to include human beings. So they're basically two distinct points, like A and B. And A is where you feel as if you're separate from someone or something, and B is where we feel connected as one with someone or something. And basically, to me, not empathizing connotes point A, which is where we're feeling separate, and B is where we are empathizing, where we feel connected as one. So I think that, in some ways, kind of gets at the heart of what the word empathy is intended to do. But I think it's also useful to mention that, in my opinion, it also admits that it only gets at the why, not the how. Because we often say things like, scientists argue that empathy can be explained by mirror neurons. That's the how of empathy. Or somebody say like, there's theory of mind or emotional contagion. There's a lot of theories that try to
Yep.
argue why they believe empathy works. But I think nobody really knows, just the way I think we have reached a level of understanding with, even with gravity, we're still developing our understanding of how gravity actually works. I think in some ways the same will be true of empathy. We'll continue to learn how empathy actually works.
Hmm. Well, yeah, and you talk in the book quite a bit about what like realizing empathy. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah. So I don't think I do a very succinct job of explaining what realizing empathy is in the book. So let me do it here. So, so we
Cool.
realize empathy when we empathize with someone or something we previously could not,
Hmm.
by experiencing a moment of realization. Right? So where we go, aha, or ah, or even burst out with laughter concerning
Hmm.
something we either did not or incorrectly assume to understand or appreciate fully. Right?
Hmm.
So realizing empathy is not something we do, but rather a kind of a transformative event that moves us from
Hmm.
not empathizing to empathize, right? And that move is sparked by a realization of some sort. Right? So I came up with this term because I was basically trying to explain what was going on in art school. I was like, I didn't empathize with artists, but then I had a bunch of realizations, and now I understand artists. Like, ooh, like why isn't there a word for this? Like, let me make one. Realizing empathy. But then, like after I came up with the phrase, I think I've also found it useful in contrast to the phrase having empathy, right? Because I
Hmm.
think the phrase having empathy is prone to misunderstanding, right? Because it's like people
Yeah.
hear the phrase and they think it's either we have it or we don't. Right? It's like it's as if we can judge someone as a psychopath just because they can't or won't empathize with us, right? So just because I couldn't empathize with artists, it doesn't mean I was a psychopath. I hope. Just because just because the professors couldn't empathize with me,
Yep.
it doesn't mean they were psychopaths either. Sure, there may be psychopaths who genuinely lack empathy, but the
Hmm.
vast majority of people have empathy. It's just that we can't will ourselves to have a realization that moves
Yep.
us from not empathizing to empathizing. So I think having that phrase, I think, is important because it sort of respects the humanity in us all instead of trivializing or judging or criticizing people for not behaving the way we want them to behave.
Well, yeah, and it also strikes me too that, you know, having empathy can get us maybe into a stuck, divided place, whereas realizing it's like there's movement, there's motion. And I think a lot about like in the reading the book, you're creating things like there's like flow and movement even in these inanimate objects. So I love that you defined the difference between those. That's a really incredible distinction. Um, and it's really interesting that empathy begins, its life as it relates to artwork rather than not humans, as you talked about. And you also emphasize in your book that we can realize empathy in relation to non-humans, inanimate objects like wood. One of my favorite parts about the book. I was surprising for me. And as a fine artist, you learned a great deal about working with different kinds of materials, and specifically how to listen to them, how to understand their nature and the best way to work with them. And I'm just curious if you could expand on why is empathy with inanimate objects so important and how might it apply to software development?
Yeah. So I think I don't know if this is still true, but when I was being trained as a computer scientist, their term grok was very well known.
Mm. Hmm.
And as far as I can tell, to grok is basically to understand by realizing empathy. And the most common use of the word grok in programming is to say that we grok a particular programming language, right? And what that means is that we have not only come to know the syntax and grammar of the language, but also have had a series of realizations that gave us an understanding and appreciation of the philosophy and the worldview held by the creator of the language. Right? And when we begin to grok with a programming language creator, we feel much more connected as one with the language. It feels like an extension of our mind, right? So that's obviously an example where empathy is very much, I think, in my mind, central to computer science programming and development. Another example, I think, is with the computer itself. Right? So I remember when I first learned how to program, I could not, for the love of my life, empathize with the computer.
Same, same. When I was in college, I was like, I'm talking to the computer, you're not answering.
It's not listening. um, so it was partly because I had yet to grok the programming language, which was for me like C and C++.
Yep.
But it also turns out another reason was because I had trouble, or rather, the reason why I had trouble grokking C and C++ was because I had trouble grokking with the computer. Right?
Mm.
So, and I wrote about this in the intro of the book, where I once took a computer apart and learned about how hardwares like memories and CPU work. Then all of a sudden, I could much more easily empathize with a computer. And notably, like in C and C++, a major part of programming is managing memory. And there's like things like pointers. These are ideas that I just never could get my head around until I fully appreciated the physicality of the computer itself and realizing, oh, the computer needs to know exactly where to put something. It's sort of like giving somebody the room number. Like, of course they need a room number. How would they find a room? I'm like, oh, I totally get it now. Right? And I think in the same way, the exact same thing happens in art, where people sort of have to learn about wood sufficiently before they can make a piece of furniture well, right? So in the sort of the school that I went to, it was a very traditionally kind of oriented school. So they almost prevent you from making anything using a machine until we all know how to do it by hand, right? So for example, we spent, I don't know, like 3 or 4 weeks just learning how to plane wood. Planing is where you make a wood flat on all sides. And like most people will be like, why would you do that? Like you put it in a machine and just like planes it for you. Like, you idiot. But the idea is you could do that, but then you have no idea it's sort of like you have a kind of an automated button you click and it just does everything for you. Then how could you possibly know how to program, right? So planing wood by yourself by hand really sensitizes you to how the wood responds to your every touch. And it also helps you understand like what works, what doesn't, when it chips, when it doesn't. This sort of hypersensitivity of what wood would do, or if I were to personify, like how wood would think if I were to say certain things, like all these sort of sensitivities are trained by learning more and more about materials as if they are other people with whom we must develop a relationship, right? And this is very, very central to how craft-based training has always been. And I think in some ways, a lot of that is going away because even in art schools nowadays, they have CNC machines and 3D printers and whatnot. So nobody really needs to do anything by hand anymore. So I think there's a bit of a danger in the level of abstraction became so high that people are going to lose touch of what's really going on. And they may realize way too late, oh my God, I had no idea that I was using that much memory or something like that.
Yeah, I love your story because I started learning how to program in C++, and
Did you?
maybe
Okay.
It was terrible.
It was hard, wasn't it?
It was hard. Then I learned, PHP, and that was better. And then I learned Ruby, and I can empathize with Ruby. Ruby is my. I'm sorry, everybody. I love all languages are wonderful, but for me, Ruby, I was like, oh, but maybe if I took the computer apart, I would have been better at C++. I barely made it through that class. It was like freshman year in college.
Enough respect that you're able to program in any language. Thank you for attempting that.
Yeah, I mean, I love Ruby now. So if one thing that stood out with the stories, and one in particular that just really struck me. So for everybody who hasn't read, Slim was learning how to solder metal. And you're following each step carefully, but the metal would not melt, right? And you're like, what's happening? and like I did this and I did, you can just see in your head like you're going through the checklist. Check, and it's just not it's just not melting. And then finally, with the help of a friend, you discovered a hidden component of the process, which is the object you were soldering on, right? Like a brick. And so it made me curious, how do we open ourselves to see more of the context while creating, like, and particularly like maybe in the software development process, but in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of those things where it's really interesting or worth it to question the question itself, right? So, for example, when we ask ourselves, how do we open ourselves to see more of the context while creating? The assumption is that the reason why we cannot see more of the context is because we're closed, right?
Mm.
And this may be the true in some cases, but in many cases, we are open, but we still cannot see more of the context. And I think that's because we won't be able to see until our perspective shifts in that direction. Like, so our eyes are still open, but we still have to look in a particular direction for us to be able to see it, right? And
Mm.
shifting perspectives is hard, not because we don't know how to shift perspectives, because we know we can just turn our head around, but we don't know exactly where to shift our perspective to. So I think this is why we have the concept of insight, which is the moment when our perspective shifts in just the right direction and we can see it, whatever it is. So the
Yeah.
question, if I were to sort of reframe it, is how can we shift our perspective in just the right direction so we can see more of the context we need to see at
Mm.
that particular moment to make progress in that particular endeavor. Right? So that sort of like exposes the complexity that sort of makes it obvious why this is so difficult. And I think it's one of those things where the general rule of thumb is basically we need to be constantly seeking out new perspectives, and it's
Mm.
not something that we intuitively or sort of habitually do. We just try to work harder. I mean, like that's the way I've been trained. Like, I don't know if this is just like sort of like my tiger mom Asian upbringing, but like if you can't do something, just work harder. That's what you're supposed to do. That's just the way I've been.
I didn't have a tiger mom, but I had a Protestant father, family of farmers, upbringing.
Yeah, well,
So
maybe it's the human condition, right? But for whatever reason, instead of seeking out new perspective, we just work harder. I think that's the
yeah.
default stance that many of us have. So, so basically, first of all, we need to be seeking out new perspectives constantly, and even knowing that it's not so easy because in my case, that new perspective was delivered to me by my friend, so all was good. They were very kind of an easy situation. But we don't always know where to find that particular perspective that's needed. And even if we do know, it's sometimes hard to look in that direction. Like for
Mm.
example, like you have a friend who tells you all your flaws of what you're doing wrong, and you know they're not wrong. You know these things are true, but I still don't want to listen to that person or want to admit it. There's something about there's a difficult time looking in a particular direction for a variety of reasons. So even knowing that we need to seek out new perspectives, it can still be a bit of a challenge. But at the very least, I think the choice becomes ours, right? So we can actually take responsibility for it. Like, so, okay, so I know that I need to seek out new perspectives, or I'm just going to keep spinning my wheels and just work harder and harder and harder and burn out. So that I have a choice. Do I do that or do I not, right? So that at least we have that choice. Now, just to be clear, if you do decide to go off and seek out new perspective, I want to make sure that you recognize how much appreciation you deserve, because it's not the default mode that we operate under, and it can actually be very difficult, right? Just to share a little bit of a personal story, it wasn't until my mid 30s that I reconciled with my own father.
Mm.
So until then, my mother would constantly say things to shift my perspective to see a different side of my father, and I just wasn't having it, right? So I could understand and appreciate the difficulty of moving ourselves from not empathizing to empathize or seeing in a certain direction. Right? So this is not a trivial matter, I think. But if you decide not to, I just can't blame you because I was the same. Right? It's one of those things. Technically, it's only been about a decade since my mid 30s that I've developed a kind of a normal relationship with my father. So I think it's useful to acknowledge how hard this is, but at the same time keep in our mind that we have two choices. We can either go forward with the attempt to realize empathy or not.
Yeah, it's so it's so good. Thank you for sharing that personal story. I think this really hits home for a lot of us. Just in general, like how relationships can break, and empathy. is really important in relationships and relationship building. And of course, relationships are important in work. So it's beautiful. I just have a couple more last quick questions. What makes realizing empathy with others so difficult? Like you're talking about, like, with your father, and I think that lots of us, by the way, have that too at work, not just with long standing with parents.
Yeah, no, that's very, very true. And I'm glad that you asked that question because that question came up a lot during my tour in 2013, right?
Mm.
And it basically sparked a kind of a major evolution of my work since then, right, for the past 7 or so years. So let me first be clear, once again, that realizing empathy isn't something we can will to happen, right? Which means, technically speaking, it's beyond easy or difficult. It's basically out of our hands. So sometimes it seems easy to realize empathy because it just happens. Other times it seems hard because we have trouble empathizing with someone or something, right? So if we reframe the question to why do we have trouble empathizing with people, then that usually it's because we're either unaware of something, experiencing too much tension, or both, right? So if it's purely a lack of awareness, then provided that the person is willing to become aware of that thing, it won't be too hard to empathize. It's sort of like that story in the metal shop. Once I became aware that the thing was sucking heat, I was like, oh, I immediately empathize. I'm like, ooh, I see the light of the day. But sometimes it's not merely a lack of awareness. There's also tension in that, right? And this is something I've come to define very clearly since then. So tension, for example, to me is a conflict between what we need or value versus what we have instead. So for example, in art school, I found it difficult to empathize with the professors who didn't empathize with me. And that's because they were actively threatening my sense of self and self-worth by telling me that they would kick me out, right? I needed to feel respected, appreciated, and understood, but I didn't feel any of those things. Instead, so there's a conflict between what I needed, which was to feel respected, understood, and appreciated, and what I had instead, which was feeling disrespected, misunderstood, and underappreciated. So I think in some ways, could I say that there's something that once I become aware of, that I may be able to empathize with those professors? Sure, but I'm not willing. I'm not ready to go there just yet. So there's still a little bit left in me, right? I need to work on that. So
all of us can feel that too, right? I mean, I think what you're saying is so. I'm nodding because I'm like,
we're
been there. I bet everybody's like, I've been there. I know I needed to empathize, and I'm like, I'm not ready.
Not ready. Don't force me to empathize with people, right? I'm going to do it on my own terms, right? Well, I think it's also worth mentioning to sort of bring it to the technology and context. So in my 20s, I thought I had a lot of empathy. And the reason why I thought that is because I was doing human-centered design. And human-centered design, if you don't know, is branded on empathy. It's like empathy all over the place, right? Empathy, empathy, empathy. So, but when I think back to that time when I was doing human-centered design, I didn't feel a lot of tension in my relationship to customers. The tension, if I had any, was usually quickly released when I had those interviews with them. And like we were like buddies right afterwards. So I had really not a lot of difficulty moving myself from not empathizing to empathizing with customers. That was not a challenge. On the other hand, I had a very difficult time empathizing with the CEOs of the companies that hired us because they canceled a lot of the design projects that I worked on. Right? And the products and services we designed never saw the light of day. Right? Sometimes we had spent like 2 or 3 years on it and they canceled it. Right? Yeah. So I needed their approval and permission to, make my dream come true of making the world a better place. Right? And they crushed it. So I experienced a lot of tension in that relationship. Right? So I wasn't willing to try and move myself from not empathizing to empathizing with them. Instead I felt really, really bitter and resentful. I remember judging them as lacking courage, lacking empathy, greedy, whatever, like all the things that I can come up with, I would just criticize and judge them until the cows come in. Right? And it wasn't until I found my tribe of, ironically, startup founders that I started to slowly empathize with what they were going through. Right? So that was like almost a decade after I held that grudge against the people that that I called my clients, right? So in some sense, not only did this process help me empathize with artists, but also people with whom I really had a lot of difficulty empathizing in the past, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's one of those things where I think even in human-centered design, we always say like stakeholders, they're part of the thing. It's really important to empathize with all the stakeholders. I don't think I really practiced that because it was hard, right?
Yep.
But I recognize both the difficulty and the importance of that much more so now that I've gone through this process. And I think it's one of those things where it's very easy to lose sight of that. But if we lose sight of that, the probability with which our dreams of making the world a better place comes true goes down. And it also sort of dehumanizes a lot of people who may not deserve to be dehumanized. Because once we're able to sort of connect at a human level, there may be ways in which we can meet both of our needs at the same time. It's just that there isn't that conversation to be had. So I think it's one of those things where, yes, it's very difficult to realize empathy when there's significant tension, if you're a normal human being like myself.
I love that. I'm going to ask one last question because I do want to make sure we're running short on time. I want to get people that have questions in Slack. So my last question is, it sounds like delving into what makes realizing empathy difficult has been a major evolution of your work since the book was published. I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about where you've landed as like sort of our closing on our conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the tension is really the big piece. So I'll use an analogy because I think it'll drive the point home clearly. The analogy I want to use is muscle development. Right? So if you wanted to develop your muscles, what would you do, Susan?
Use it.
Yeah, right. Exactly. You do exercises, you lift weights, you do something with your muscles, right? I think that's the way most people would answer that question. Except what using your muscles actually does is they create tension in your muscles. So much so that they actually tear it. They cause micro damages to your muscle. And it's only when those micro damages recover that our muscles actually develop. So once again, exercising and using our muscles causes damages to our muscle. It's only when they recover that they develop. Right? So I think what I did in my book is I talk mostly about what exercises you can do with your mind, like how you can use your empathy muscle, so to speak. Except what I've learned by reflecting on my experience since writing the book is the constant push to succeed in my creative process or making something created a lot of tension in myself and in my relationship. Right? So much so that I incurred a lot of damage. Right? And it's really important for me now to think about, okay, how do I continuously manage and recover from these tensions and damages on an ongoing basis, not 10 years down the road, but like on a regular basis. That I believe is super, super, super important. So I think I've been focusing a lot of my time on that sort of subject matter. And sort of the quote that really drove this home is, did you see the Last Dance, the documentary on Netflix about Michael Jordan recently?
I have not.
So there's a guy called Tim Grover that comes out in that show, and he's basically Michael Jordan's trainer, and he's been his trainer for about 15 years. So he really knows Michael very well, right? And he says in a GQ interview, and I wrote this down, everyone teaches you how to go, go, go. Nobody teaches you how to stop. But the quicker, stronger, faster you make an individual, the more susceptible they are to injuries if they don't know how to handle the speed, power, and agility. So I told Michael, I don't care how fast you are or how high you jump. None of that matters if you're constantly getting injured, which was what was happening with Michael before Tim came on board and started to help take Michael's performance to the next level, right? So for me, if I were to, and as I sort of make progress on this work, I really want to encourage people to think, especially knowledge workers, who rarely think about the equivalent between their physical muscles and their sort of psychological or relationship muscles. Think of them as muscles, right? Because you're going to experience tension in two situations. When you're thinking alone, trying to figure something out, causing a lot of junk and jumble in your mind, or in your relationship with people. So I think it's one of those things. Yes, it's necessary to experience tension for us to develop our psychology and our relationship. But at the same time, it's just as important to recognize that we need to continuously recover and manage these tensions on an ongoing basis if we want to develop and mature as human beings, developers, leaders, or whatnot.
Yeah, and I wanted to say something that I think slightly relates, which is, in my own experiences in my coach training, I studied like sort of like group and partnered coaching. And John Gottman, who is a renowned relationship researcher, talks about
Right.
repair in relationship. And that just strikes me that you're sort of speaking to that, a little bit of like the idea of repair, like intrapersonally within ourselves, but then interpersonally. And I think there's a lot of connections to empathy. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
just wanted to mention that. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it. I always call it a show. I don't think it's really a show. I like to pretend I have a show. Hi, I'm Susan. Welcome to this episode. But I'm just laughing at myself. Thank you so much for being here. We really
Sure,
appreciate it.
it's a pleasure. I mean, as I was saying earlier, like when the book came out in 2013, I was sort of like in the position of like constantly pushing my book. It's like, oh, I have a book, understand me, appreciate me, that sort of a thing.
Yeah.
And then since then, I was like, whatever. I just keep doing what I'm doing. But then, like to find out that a group of people like yourselves, the community that you belong, have found some value in this and let me know, that is just amazing. So thank you very much for seeking me out.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you. Thank you everybody for just joining us during this session. Slim will be in the lead dev Slack. We'll just be there for a couple minutes because we talked so much. But what is an incredible conversation. Hopefully it has your heads all buzzing. Head over to the Bookmarks channel where that'll be taking place. Our next session will be December 8th, where we'll be talking with Edmund Lau about his book, The Effective Engineer. And on January 12th, we'll be speaking to Marty Kagan about his book, Inspired. Thanks, everybody.